Thank you, Larry. This is a significantly larger hall than I was expecting. So earlier today, I actually had somebody ask me if I work for a race car team. I do not, but my company does sponsor one. This is not, in fact, our corporate shirt. This is a shirt I had to buy. It's the team shirt for the Mercedes AMG Formula One team. But I do work for Petronas, and my name is Rahayu Ramli. I'm the head of cyber strategy and architecture in Petronas. And what that translates to is that I would do a lot of slides, like the ones that you're going to see today. And the reason why I do a lot of slides is because a significant portion of my work is centered around putting together the strategies around security for Petronas, as well as explaining to our leadership and to our teams across both IT and OT why it's necessary. So for today, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what we do in cybersecurity in Petronas to give you context around our zero trust journey and the work that we've been doing with Zage. Yeah? So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll also be around for the rest of the conference as well. So I thought I'd start a little bit more with what is Petronas. So other than sponsoring Formula One teams, we are also a multinational oil and gas company. We're an integrated oil and gas company, which means that we run the gamut of oil and gas value chains, which means that we produce, we refine, as well as sell to end consumers as well to businesses along the entire fuel chain. Now, that sounds familiar. I'm sure you've heard ExxonMobil and Chevron talk about the work that they do in OT cybersecurity as well. And I think one of the common things that we see across the board is the breadth of the work that we do within this industry. So we're not just about the different businesses across upstream, downstream, retail, as well as our sustainable business, which we have started growing. We are also a company of 50,000 strong employees across more than 50 countries, which as a cybersecurity practitioner is a tiny bit of a nightmare, right? When you think about the number of endpoint devices, when you think about the span of our network, the number of devices that are coming on board as people are working remotely and in the office and at site. So this is a tremendous landscape that they're working within. And for us, when we talk about technology, it's something that within the company itself, we've been using forever, right? The whole point of being able to find the oil and refine the oil and sell the oil means that we've been using technology for decades, right? So now as we've been moving into this digital space, how is it that we're making technology work for us as an organization? So one of the things that you'll see in the lower left, right-hand corner is our three-pronged strategy. And in this whole digital transformation age that everybody keeps talking about, one of the things that did happen was the pandemic. One of the things that did happen again was the oil price crash. And just the whole supply and demand volatility of the market has led us to look at the way we run our business differently. The thing that I've seen consistently over the conference in the last couple of days is that this story isn't that different across different industries. I think we're looking at our core businesses, how to strengthen them. We're looking at different ways that we can expand that core and think and step out beyond that core. And again, as a cybersecurity practitioner, that is kind of my ultimate nightmare, right? So I want the business to thrive, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we do it securely. And the question is, how is, right? So for us, that actually started with our digital journey. And we try to avoid the word transformation as much because it really is a very, very long journey for us, and I think for many organizations of our size. We formally started back in 2017 and officially kicked off what we called that journey in 2018. And it was significantly less about the technology itself, right? I think, and again, because we have been a technical company for a very long time, moving into digital made sense. But what were we doing? Why were we doing things that we were doing? And ultimately, at the core of it, what we wanted to do was change the way that we work, right? So how to have the technology help our efficiency, our productivity, our safety in the way that we do things, both in the operating technology environment as well as in our offices in our day-to-day. So that was a journey that we started back in 2018 and has grown rapidly, thank you to the pandemic. And I think what we've also seen as a byproduct of that is that there is significantly more trust in the ability for technology to do the things that we suspected it could do before, right? So from prior to that, I think people were like, things that aren't broken, we don't need to fix it. But then when the pandemic came around, we were forced to actually look at how do we keep our frontliners safe with less people at the plants and at the rigs? How do we make sure that even if we can't be there in person, that our automated operations can work as efficiently? There was significantly more trust put into that technology to do the things that prior to that we trusted humans to do. And so again, from a business standpoint, amazing. It's cost savings, great for our resourcing. It's also a cybersecurity nightmare because it means that my perimeter is constantly shifting at every point during the day. So as we moved into this year, one of the things that we wanted to look at from a digital standpoint was to move away from being a pure enabler to being a business partner in every way, right? So we're integrated into the decision-making, into the products that we build and that we procure, and how we deploy things is according to a structure that reviews for both safety as well as efficiency of design. And that is where we want to take ourselves to being digital as a natural imperative to the way that we work. And that's the vision for our digital journey that is taking us forward. So you might wonder, where does cybersecurity fit into all of this? From the standpoint of our landscape, and I'm sure anybody that's either in oil and gas or manufacturing is very familiar with this separation. IT and OT was still very much two separately owned as well as operated arms when it came to technology governance, right? And this was a natural separation. For the most part, both could coexist peacefully without really minding the business of the other. And that was because, as many of you may in practice already know, managing an IT/OT are two very separate, two very different worlds in the sense of speed, what you care about, and as well as the age and the type of technology that you're working with. Yeah? So in IT, it's very common to have refreshes every 3 to 5 years, 5 to 6 years, especially now when apps have a shelf life of 2 to 3 years, it's significantly faster. But in OT, you put significant investment into the machines that you build, that you customize to be appropriate to your business, the software that's layered on top of it, and the amount of segregation that you need to have to keep those systems safe, right? You're talking about decades of age when it comes to this machinery, to that operational technology. It's not something you simply shut down to be able to service or put security patches into, right? So they were two very different philosophies trying to coexist in the same environment. And for the most part, that wall was very strong in between. But when we started to look at what digital actually meant to production, there was a clear sort of vagueness that was happening with that boundary, right? As we shifted to look at how we process data from the OT environment in the cloud, when we started to look at how we could control sensors remotely, when we started to talk about remote autonomous operations, all of that then started to bring up the question, where does that technology sit and how do you take care of it? Okay? And so that was, the ultimate question was, we're not trying to meld the two environments. They're two clearly different environments with different objectives, but then where do we put the similarities together for us to be able to operate in a seamless manner across both IT and OT, right? What does that mean for cybersecurity? Well, from a security standpoint, we had been operating separately as well, right? And again, because of the segregation of the technology landscapes themselves, it was quite easy to move forward in that direction up until the point we decided that the new technology was more useful within the OT environment than it was outside, right? So in that case, what was it that we needed to look at in order to be able to work as one whole unit as an organization? And that's where we shifted our cybersecurity strategy to become what we call enterprise-wide from the aspect of not just the technology itself, but from governance. And I remember when I was preparing this deck with Duncan from Zage, we were talking about how every time we talk about collapsing boundaries in IT and OT, some people in the room will start to get nervous, including myself, because there's it's very vague what that means, right? When you collapse the boundary, does it mean you're integrating everything? Do we share data all over the place? Does our governance even mean the same thing across the two different environments? It does not. And I think one of the things we've learned in Petronas is that the idea is not to crash the two environments together, but to see how we can actually bring them together with the objective of serving the organization as opposed to ultimate objectives with the machinery or the technology. So ultimately, everything that we've done in cybersecurity is underpinned by what is required by the business. And ultimately, where we want to be is proactive against threats that are known to us and resilient against threats that we do not, right? So in the event that something does happen, we're able to recover and have the least amount of downtime possible with any of the systems that do go down as a result. Right, so a lot of our focus, again, starting in 2018, was building the fundamental capability around this. Bear with me, I will get to the zero trust component in a bit. So the Petronas cybersecurity function as an organization is still relatively young. We were formed in 2018 and are continuing to grow. And in the last 4 years, we have focused on what you see at the bottom, the strategic deployment program, that has really focused on establishing clear structures around our governance, how we're managing our assets, and tracking antivirus and OS patching in our OT environment. We are looking into building an identity and access management network that is meant to actually control how people access and go into both our IT and OT systems. We've put a significant amount of investment in change management and education. That's been a whole army of people that are dedicated to not just ensuring people are on board to the digital journey, but as well as understanding why security is such an important component of our entire jobs. And last, of course, is the cyber defense capability. This might sound fundamental, but it's tied to everything else that we're currently doing. We do have an in-house SOC, and it's one of the big things that we put in place to enable our own visibility both across IT and OT, and has been a fundamental building block in the way that we protect the organization. Now, this is the story sort of between 2018 to 2022. Where we're looking forward and where we've started to formulate our strategies moving forward is with that big blockbuster word, zero trust. Because everybody and their grandma is doing zero trust now. And the minute that we started to look into this, and this was way back in 2020 when we were discussing how to build an identity and access management framework that would encompass all of the organization. We started to realize that it really wasn't just about the identity or the access. It was really about being able to verify and validate who had access and to what in our ecosystem, right? Regardless of which part that was in IT or OT. And so as part of that, we also built out a secure by design strategy, which has had us toss the words DevSecOps and application security around quite repeatedly. But what we've realized is that because of the diversity of our environment, that's not enough, right? So secure by design isn't simply about development. It's about our procurement practices. It's about how we put our contracts together with our third-party vendors and our partners, and understanding that the design itself is not limited to what we do within the organization, right? So when vendors work with us, when partners work with us, we are equally responsible for the data that we share with them or how we process their information, and vice versa. So those two key things have been underpinning our strategy moving forward, which is something we're taking forward and expect to be able to be pushing out over the next 3 to 5 years across the board, right? So this isn't a 24-hour sort of journey and something we're expecting to go for quite a while moving forward and be the centerpiece of our security. So how does that actually fit into our OT problem statement? So I mentioned very briefly just now about the work that we've been doing in the OT space. I actually have some colleagues from our engineering teams, the group technical solution team, that focuses on the work that we do and the technology that we deploy in the OT environment in Petronas. And that has been one of the biggest focuses of our cybersecurity program since 2018, was making sure that we were able to create cybersecurity visibility across all of our assets within the OT environment, and also trying to figure out what's the most effective way for us to apply zero trust principles in an OT environment that is so diverse, right? So the same principles that we might use across IT were not going to be applicable 100% across OT, which is very true for many of the things that we're doing, and vice versa from OT to IT. So the question became how do we actually tackle issues like this? So one of the areas that we were looking at is identity. We have an identity governance and administration system that we're currently applying in our IT environment, and we've been exploring how we're going to do that in OT, whether it's possible. Right, we're still in pilot stage. I don't have answers specific to that area, but it is an area of immediate concern because of the number of both vendors and users that are in our OT environments in various different systems, right? And moving forward, as we look towards increased remote autonomous and just autonomous operation in general, we also expect there to be an increase in machine-to-machine communication as well, right? And so that's, regardless of whether you are human or machine, we need to know who or what accesses the system for how long and to do what exactly, right? So one of the things that did come up was around remote access, and the reason being, of course, is that as we've moved towards an increase in remote operations, autonomous or not, there has been a need to be more secure in the areas of allowing people into our environments from remote locations. We had an existing solution. The solution worked for as long as it did until it didn't, right? And this has typically happened when we're starting to see more vendors come on board and more functionality and capability that we're bringing into the environment. So very specifically in this situation, we were looking for a solution that would allow us much stricter and granular control over access that was coming in from remote locations. And in many situations, we were finding that the work that we were doing with our vendors from remote locations was for support. And there were some key things that our current solution at that point could not do, and we could not risk, especially given that a lot of the attacks that have been happening in the OT space or related to the OT space are through failure in remote access, right? So we were looking at the controls that we currently had in place and found that the incumbent solution was not able to fulfill that, right? So if you've ever had to set up any sort of VPN connection, especially in the OT environment, I'm sure you're familiar with this diagram. We're not going to run through this in detail, but the point of it is that we needed several different things to be set up and maintained in order for us to enable remote access from our vendors or even from some of our teams that were from remote locations, right? And that also meant that we had to have a jump server set up and maintain, an RDP connection put into place, and all of this had to be monitored as well as secured at any point in time. Right? So this was a very typical setup, and we'd been running this for quite some time. But what we started to notice is that there were several controls that were not in place. For example, the connection between L3, the DMZ or 3.5 to 4 was not encrypted using the solution that we had, and especially with the amount of information that's been traveling out of level 3 and below, when we're processing information, this was of course a critical component in that entire structure. Right? So we wanted to ensure that whatever we did moving forward could enable end-to-end encryption for us to ensure that the data in transit would be secure and any sort of transaction could be tracked. We also wanted to ensure that we could minimize the amount of setup that we had to do. For the most part, all the OT work that we've tried to do from a cybersecurity perspective, we tried to automate and simplify as much as possible. Our OT teams are busy. The production line, the refineries are our lifelines, and we need to make sure that our OT teams are able to focus on that work and not so much about maintaining a lot of this, the infrastructure that needs to be in place for a lot of this. So when we were looking at sort of what we wanted to apply. First, in this very restricted use case, we wanted to be able to ensure that we were working already at that point secure by design, as well as applying zero trust principles. And again, coming back to zero trust, the famous, the buzzwords that are centered around zero trust talk a lot about identity, access, as well as architecture. But fundamentally, what you want to be able to do is see, right? You want to be able to see who's accessing it, at what time, for how long, and doing what. And for the most part, any sort of solution that talks about zero trust will look into this. But I think fundamentally what we also wanted on top of that was to be able to deploy in a way that was simple, fast, and scalable, given the size and the spread of the sites that we have within our organization. So again, from the Zage perspective, so I was joking with the Zage team that had they come to us at the end of 2021 when we started doing our zero trust strategy, we would have told them to go away, which is essentially what we told every single vendor that came to our door at that point, because we were still trying to figure out what we wanted to do with this. What did it actually mean to apply these type of principles to the structure that we had and to the infrastructure design that we had in place? But their timing was perfect, because at the point at which we started looking at our access capability and how we were using identity in the OT environment, there were many different options out there. But our concerns were around speed, agility, and security, and the ability for us to be able to segregate and segment out in the case of any sort of breach. Right? And so when Zage came into the picture, we were looking for something that was, again, easy to deploy, but also it would enable us visibility in segments across our entire OT environment. And for this, it allowed us to move away from what we like to call the M&M model. So we have a very hard shell of IT and a very soft OT center, but this gave us the capability through its mesh to be able to harden across the entire stack, right? So it means that we're not just looking at hardening the standard way around our firewalls and what we do in the IT environment, but going down to the very levels where we're able to place the entire mesh and ensure that we're securing down to that granular level. And of course, Duncan can talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially we were looking at how we could strengthen that stack from the inside out. And I'm not going to drain this slide. But essentially what I wanted to point out is on the right side of the slide is the structure that we commonly use to describe how a Zage setup would look like, right? And the Zage fabric is essentially a mesh, and it allows us to actually place nodes within our infrastructure that would allow us the capability to segment, to separate, and also to be able to, in the event of a breach, be able to segment out the areas that were affected, but use the subnodes or the sections that are not affected to be able to heal themselves. And again, I'm going to let Duncan talk about this in more detail, but the idea being is that the amount of what we could do with the Zage fabric allowed us a much more granular access to the way that we allowed people into our systems, and also enabled us to create much more granularity in the way that we monitored that access as well. Right? The other thing that's very important in our decision to move forward with Zage was the fact that there are no clients, there are no agents. It's purely software designed so that we're able to deploy as undisruptive as possible to our operations, which has been critical in our strategy in our OT deployment overall for cybersecurity, as much as we can to not disrupt current operations or work around the schedules that we currently have and the infrastructure that's already in place. Okay. So we ran a POC with Zage late last year. And this was something, and again, being in the IT environment, even in OT, I think we're always surprised when something happens in less than 6 months, right? If we're able to procure, set up, design, and come up with something within 6 months, I think we would consider that to be light speed already in the technology environment. We were able to set up the POC end-to-end and complete it within a month, right? And that was something to us, especially in the context of OT, when there are many different components by virtue of the Purdue model that we had to consider. This was pretty amazing, all intents and purposes. So the fact that we were able to set this up very quickly, we were able to work with the Zage team very closely as well. So this was very much a collaborative effort, as much as it was a technical deployment for us. And essentially what it came down to was the point that in addition to all the capability that we could need as part of our remote access strategy, was also the fact that we were able to do this safely without disrupting the environment. And in that way, it also led to cost and time savings for us as well. I mean, one of the things that we've seen as part of our OT deployment, especially with the pandemic, is just the shortage of hardware that required for us to complete some of these deployments. And that, again, not only has a time impact, but a cost impact as well. And I think for us to be able to deploy something so quickly with the least amount of disruption possible means that we spend less effort on trying to figure out how to deploy, but instead looking at the outcome of the deployment instead. Right? So it really was a very positive experience for us. And we're currently in the stages of preparing for a full rollout to roughly, I think, about 500 users and 50 plus sites across our different environments. So again, not going to drain this slide, but just wanted to point out in comparison to that initial standard remote access architecture that I showed earlier, there are significantly less pieces for us to worry about in this architecture, right? So the idea is that once we deploy the Zage fabric across our architecture, that is the only thing that we have to be concerned about. No more jump servers, no more RDP points, and purely just the mesh for us to both manage as well as obtain monitoring capability from directly. Okay. So our OT cybersecurity journey is really just beginning, and there's so many different areas that we are still looking into. For example, we are experimenting with, we're not experimenting, but I think exploring in more detail sort of how the cloud is going to benefit our OT environment and how are we going to secure that. So there are going to be components about managing data in transit, as well as access to that cloud itself. We're also looking at other access control. As I mentioned before, we're looking at IGA, or Identity Governance Administration, in OT as well. And we wanted to understand better how authentication could be improved using Zage. So there's many different areas that we are exploring. I'm really looking forward to what we can do in this space. Welcome any questions later. Thank you so much for your attention.